In the quiet buzz of the city's evening rush, everything felt ordinary. The streets were crowded, the lights flashing in a rhythmic dance as cars swerved and honked in the congested traffic. Yet, in the midst of it all, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first, but the unsettling silence in my head was enough to make me pause. The usual chatter of my thoughts, the hum of the world around me, seemed to dim as the car slowed to a halt at a red light. I glanced out the window, momentarily lost in the neon blur of the cityscape. The light turned green, and I was about to drift back into my thoughts when a figure appeared, stepping onto the street from an alleyway, a figure I immediately recognized. It was Nathan, my dad's business partner, standing right there in the middle of the road, looking strangely out of place. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Nathan. I hadn't seen him in weeks, not since that business meeting at the office where he'd seemed distant, distracted even. A man who normally carried an air of confidence, now looked different. There was something in his posture, in the way he stood there, waiting, that made my stomach churn. It wasn't the usual polite nod I might have expected, but rather something much more intense, much more uncertain. Before I could react, he caught my eye. A brief flicker of recognition, followed by a slight wave. I blinked, wondering if I should ignore it. It wasn't like I knew him personally. He was my dad's business partner, not someone I'd ever really spoken to outside of a few formal exchanges. Yet, something about the way he looked at me stirred a strange feeling inside. The light had changed, but instead of driving away, I found myself slowing down. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, and I debated internally. Why was he just standing there, waiting? The usual ease in my movements seemed absent. For a moment, I wondered if I was overthinking this, maybe imagining the entire thing. Nathan's gaze never left mine as I approached him. The tension between us seemed to grow with every second that passed. When I pulled to the curb next to him, I rolled down the window, my voice coming out shakier than I intended. Hey Nathan. What's going on? His eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read. He smiled, but it wasn't his usual friendly smile. It was laced with an emotion that I couldn't quite place, like he was considering something far more than just a casual greeting. Hey, he said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that didn't belong. Can I ask you a favor? The words hung in the air, too sudden, too unexpected. There was a moment of hesitation before he continued. Dinner. It's been a long day, and I could use some company. I know this isn't the most conventional way to ask, but, how about it? I was taken aback. Nathan had never suggested anything like this before. The world around me seemed to blur for a second, my thoughts racing. Should I say yes? Was it safe to go with him? I knew he was my dad's partner, but there was still something about this encounter that felt so unusual, so foreign. As I processed everything, the moment seemed to stretch out, the decision weighing heavier than it should have. Something told me that this wasn't just a casual dinner invitation. There was more to this, something beneath the surface. The decision to follow Nathan had been impulsive, one that I regretted almost as soon as I agreed. But it was too late to back out now. As I parked in front of a quiet restaurant tucked away on the corner of a busy street, the weight of the situation settled on my shoulders like a heavy fog. Nathan had insisted this was just a casual dinner, a way to unwind from a long day at work. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than he was letting on. We stepped inside the restaurant, a place that oozed sophistication with dim lighting and soft jazz music playing in the background. The smell of rich, earthy food filled the air, mingling with a faint scent of expensive wine. Nathan led the way to a corner booth, his presence commanding the space even in a room full of people. As we sat down, I couldn't help but notice how he seemed more poised, more self-assured than I remembered him being. The shift was subtle, but it was there, like a shadow lurking just beneath the surface. Thanks for joining me, Nathan said, his voice smooth as he glanced at me, a glimmer of something I couldn't quite place in his eyes. I wasn't sure if you'd say yes, honestly. But I thought, why not? It's been a while since we really talked. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. His words seemed innocent enough, but the tension between us was palpable, a strange undercurrent that hung in the air like an invisible thread. I felt awkward, out of place, even though I was sitting across from someone I knew. It was a feeling I hadn't expected. Nathan wasn't a stranger. He'd been a part of my life in the background for years, but this moment, this dinner, was something entirely different. The waiter came over, interrupting my thoughts, and we ordered our drinks. I kept my eyes on the menu, trying to hide my growing unease. I wasn't sure what I was doing here, what Nathan's intentions were. There had been something in his voice earlier that made my stomach twist. Something that made me feel like I was walking into a trap without even realizing it. "You know," Nathan started, his voice dropping to a softer tone, "I've always admired how you've handled yourself. Your dad's proud of you, and I can tell you're going places. But I think there's more to you than just the business side of things." His words felt heavy, loaded with meaning I wasn't prepared to unpack. I lifted my gaze slowly, meeting his eyes. For a moment, the world around us seemed to fade away. There was something in his look, a flicker of something I couldn't decipher, but it unsettled me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but there was a tremor there that I couldn't hide. I shifted in my seat, unsure of where this conversation was headed. Nathan smiled faintly, taking a sip from his glass of wine before setting it down slowly. "You've got a lot more potential than you give yourself credit for. But sometimes, I think you're too focused on the business side of things. You're so serious all the time." He leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. "Life's about more than just work. You need to experience things, take chances." I wasn't sure if it was the wine or the way he was looking at me, but I suddenly felt exposed, like he could see right through me. My thoughts were racing, but I struggled to keep them in check. What was he implying? Was he just offering advice, or was there something more? There was a subtle intensity in his gaze, something almost predatory, and it sent a shiver down my spine. Before I could respond, the waiter returned with our food, and Nathan shifted back in his seat, the moment of tension passing like a storm cloud. We both ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound in the room the soft clink of silverware against plates. But my mind was elsewhere, trying to make sense of everything. Nathan was different. There was something in the air that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. His words didn't match his actions, and every glance he gave me seemed charged with something unspoken. As we ate, he kept glancing at me, his eyes lingering just a little too long, almost as if he was waiting for me to say something, to respond in some way that I couldn't understand. I kept my distance, focusing on my food, trying to ignore the growing tension between us. But with every passing minute, it felt like the space between us was shrinking, like the lines between professional and personal were blurring. I had never seen Nathan this way before. The man I knew was confident, but reserved. The man sitting across from me now, though, there was something in him that I didn't recognize. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nathan broke the silence again. This time, his tone was softer, almost intimate. "You know, I've always thought there was something special about you," he said quietly, leaning closer. "You've got this presence. And I think you could be more than just a shadow of your father. You could be someone great." I looked at him, my heart beating faster, but I couldn't say anything. Was this just flattery? Or was he hinting at something else entirely? The words he used lingered in my mind, replaying over and over, each repetition sharpening the unease I already felt. But I wasn't prepared for what he said next. Maybe you should stop pretending that you're only here for business. Maybe it's time you let yourself feel something real." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt my pulse quicken. My stomach churned. Was this his idea of a compliment? Or was there something darker lurking beneath it? I tried to keep my composure, but inside, a storm was brewing. I didn't know how to respond, and the silence between us stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Nathan's eyes held mine, as if waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't find the words. I felt trapped, unsure of where this conversation was leading, and a growing sense of dread settled in my chest. At that moment, I realized that this simple dinner, wasn't about food or conversation at all. It was something else entirely, something I wasn't prepared for. And I had no idea what was about to happen next. The dinner stretched on, and with every passing moment, the tension in the air grew thicker. Nathan's words lingered like a shadow that refused to fade, casting doubt over everything I had thought was clear and simple. At first, it had seemed like just another night, an innocent dinner between two people who had known each other for years. But as the night wore on, it became something else entirely. Something unspoken, something I wasn't sure I was prepared to confront. Nathan was, as always, charming. He had a way of making everyone around him feel special, as though they were the only person in the room. But tonight, there was something different in the way he looked at me. His eyes seemed to search for something deeper, something I hadn't expected. He kept leaning in just a little too close, his gaze never wavering, and it made me increasingly uncomfortable. But at the same time, there was a strange allure to it, something magnetic that I couldn't quite escape. We spoke about everything and nothing, the conversation ebbing and flowing in a way that felt almost rehearsed. He spoke about work, his latest projects, and some of the difficulties he was facing with my father's company. His voice was smooth, professional, but there was an undercurrent to it, something personal that I couldn't place. And every time I caught myself relaxing, every time I thought the moment was over, he would say something else that threw me off balance. "You know," he said at one point, swirling the wine in his glass, "there's more to life than just playing it safe. Sometimes, you have to take a risk, step outside of what's comfortable. You can't grow if you stay in your little bubble, can you?" The words hit me harder than I expected. There was something in his voice, something soft but firm, like a challenge wrapped in a suggestion. And yet, it felt like a riddle, a puzzle I couldn't solve. His gaze never left mine, and for a moment, I felt myself growing self-conscious, my mind racing to understand what he meant. What was he really saying? I tried to laugh it off, to deflect the weight of his words with a casual smile. "I guess I'm just one of those people who likes to stick to what I know," I said, trying to sound lighthearted, but I could hear the insecurity in my own voice. Nathan tilted his head slightly, studying me as though he could see straight through my facade. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I don't think you're as predictable as you let on," he said softly. "You've got a fire inside you. I can see it in the way you talk, the way you think. You just have to let it out." The compliment felt strangely disarming. But there was something about it that unsettled me. Was he talking about work? Or was there something else he saw that I hadn't even noticed about myself? I wanted to push the thought away, to chalk it up to harmless flattery, but something about his tone kept me tethered to the moment. The waiter came to clear our plates, but neither of us seemed to notice. We were caught in the intensity of the conversation, the unspoken things hanging between us. I could feel my pulse quicken, the heat of the room suddenly becoming overwhelming. I wasn't sure whether it was the wine or something more, but I felt exposed in a way that made me want to shrink into myself. Nathan didn't make it any easier. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough that I had to lean forward to hear him. "You know, I've always thought you were a lot more than you let people see," he said, his words deliberate. "You're always so careful, so calculated. But I think there's more to you. I think you've been holding back." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't say anything. How could I? His words were both a compliment and a challenge, a mix of admiration and something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, suddenly aware of the space between us. The restaurant seemed quieter now, the low hum of conversation and clinking silverware fading into the background. It was just the two of us, and the intensity of Nathan's gaze felt suffocating. He was so close, so intent on me, that I felt myself leaning in despite my better judgment, drawn to him like a moth to a flame. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said finally, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound confident. I didn't know what to say. The air between us felt thick, as though the world had narrowed down to just this moment, just this conversation. I needed to understand, to get a sense of where this was heading, but the words I wanted to say were trapped inside. Nathan smiled, but this time, there was something different in the curve of his lips. It wasn't the easy, charming smile I had come to expect. It was more knowing, more intimate. "I think you do," he said softly. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." I swallowed hard, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. What was he trying to say? What was he implying? I tried to keep my thoughts in check, but my mind raced with possibilities. It was like a puzzle, but the pieces didn't fit. I wanted to ask him to clarify, to tell me what he meant, but a part of me was afraid to know the answer. What if I was reading too much into it? What if this was just harmless conversation, and I was turning it into something more than it was? But then, in the silence that stretched between us, the answer seemed clear, almost inevitable. Nathan's gaze never wavered. "You know," he continued, his voice lower now, Sometimes, the best things in life come when you least expect them. And I think you're at a crossroads. You can either keep playing it safe, or you can take a risk. You can step outside of your comfort zone and see where it takes you. I felt a strange pull inside me, a flutter in my chest. Was he talking about work? Or was he talking about something more personal, something deeper? The question hung in the air like a delicate thread, ready to snap at any moment. I wanted to say something, to ask him to explain, but I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I found myself leaning even closer, drawn into the gravity of his presence. I could feel the heat of his body, the quiet intensity of his gaze, and it felt like the entire world had shrunk down to just the two of us in that booth. The moment stretched on, and I could feel myself losing control of the situation. Every word he spoke seemed to pull me deeper into something I couldn't understand, couldn't explain. But I couldn't stop myself from being drawn in. You don't have to decide right now, Nathan said, his voice almost a whisper. But just think about it. Think about what you want, what you really want. The words echoed in my mind as I sat back, my thoughts swirling. What was I supposed to do with this? What was Nathan really saying? And, more importantly, what did I want? But the answer, for the first time in a long time, wasn't clear. The evening had worn on longer than I'd expected, and I was feeling the weight of everything Nathan had said, his words hanging over me like a storm that was just waiting to break. We'd finished dinner hours ago, and now we were sitting at a small bar in the back of the restaurant, nursing half-empty glasses of wine. The flickering candlelight cast shadows across Nathan's face, making his features look even sharper, more intense than I remembered. He'd barely said a word since our last conversation, and I could feel the tension between us growing with every passing minute. I didn't know what had gotten into me. I'd always been a cautious person, someone who stuck to the predictable, the safe. But something about Nathan made me want to throw caution to the wind. I couldn't help but be drawn to him, even though every instinct told me I should keep my distance. He was my father's business partner, a figure I had respected for years, and yet tonight, he seemed to be someone else entirely. I tried to push the thoughts out of my head, to focus on the present moment. But every time I looked at him, I found myself lost in his gaze, caught between curiosity and something deeper, something I wasn't ready to confront. It wasn't until Nathan stood up and walked over to the window that I realized how much my heart was racing. He was always composed, always in control, but tonight there was an unease to him that I couldn't ignore. The silence between us felt thick, suffocating, and I didn't know how to break it. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. He turned back to face me, his eyes searching mine. There was an unreadable expression on his face, something that made me uneasy. For the first time, I felt like he was sizing me up, looking at me as if I were an enigma he needed to solve. "You're different tonight," Nathan said, his voice soft but deliberate. I didn't know how to respond. What was he getting at? I opened my mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, I found myself watching him, wondering what was going through his mind. I could feel the air between us growing thicker, charged with an energy I couldn't quite define. My mind raced, trying to find a way to address the overwhelming feeling of vulnerability he'd somehow created within me. Nathan's gaze softened, and for a moment, I thought he might say something comforting, something to ease the tension. But instead, he walked back to the table, his steps slow, measured. He sat down across from me again, his expression unreadable. "You've been avoiding the truth, haven't you?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost too soft. My breath hitched in my throat, and I could feel my pulse quickening. The truth? What truth? What was he talking about? Nathan's eyes held mine, steady and unwavering. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a strange understanding. It was as though he knew something about me that I hadn't yet come to terms with. "I've watched you for a long time," he continued, his tone almost conspiratorial. "I've seen the way you look at life, at people. You want something more, don't you? You want to feel something real. Something deep." I swallowed hard, my thoughts scattered. How did he know? How could he possibly understand? I had always kept my emotions locked away, never allowing anyone to see the parts of me that felt too vulnerable, too exposed. But now, in this moment, it felt like all of it was spilling out in front of him. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice shaking, despite my best efforts to remain calm. Nathan leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "You're afraid. Afraid of what it would mean to admit the truth. Afraid of what would happen if you took a risk. But the truth is, you already know. Deep down, you know what you want. I felt my chest tighten, a cold wave of realization washing over me. He was right. I had been afraid for so long, afraid of what I might feel, afraid of what others might think. But in that moment, I could no longer deny it. I could feel it, a pull, a connection between us that I couldn't ignore. "What are you saying?" I whispered, the words coming out in a breathless rush. Nathan smiled, but it wasn't the easy, reassuring smile I was used to. It was different, tinged with something darker, something that made my stomach twist. "I'm saying you're ready. You're ready to admit what you've been feeling all along." The world seemed to go still. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and unavoidable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. My hands were trembling, and I could feel a heat rising in my face, a flush of embarrassment mixed with something else, something thrilling, something terrifying. I started, but I couldn't find the words. I couldn't process what he was saying, or what it meant for us. For me. Nathan's gaze softened again, but this time it wasn't as comforting as I had hoped. It was filled with something else, a knowing, an understanding that felt too intimate. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice low and steady. "Not yet. But you know what I'm offering." The tension in the room thickened, and I could feel my world narrowing down to just the two of us. There was no escape, no turning back. The path had been set, and I was standing at the edge, staring into the unknown. Nathan's hand moved slowly across the table, reaching for mine. It wasn't a bold move, but it was enough. Enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I stared at his hand, frozen, unsure of what to do. Every part of me screamed to pull away, to protect myself from whatever this was. But at the same time, every part of me was drawn to him, to the warmth of his touch, to the electric charge that seemed to ignite in the space between us. "I won't force you," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving mine. "But I won't let you hide from this either." The words were like a challenge, a dare, and I knew in that instant that everything was about to change. I could feel it in my bones, in the very air around us. The world outside the restaurant no longer mattered. It was just Nathan and me, caught in a moment that was both dangerous and inevitable. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. But I knew I had reached a turning point, one that would define everything that came after. Would I step into the unknown? Would I allow myself to embrace what I had been too afraid to acknowledge? Or would I walk away, leaving everything unsaid, unresolved? Nathan's fingers brushed against mine, and for a moment, I thought I might break. My mind raced with confusion, with fear, with desire, all at once. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. Whatever happened next, whatever choices we made, would change us both forever. And that realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. As the tension between Nathan and me reached its peak, everything seemed to stand still. The moment felt suspended in time, leaving me on the edge of something monumental, something I couldn't fully grasp yet. My heart was pounding, my mind racing, but the choice felt just out of reach. Was I ready to face the truth, or was I about to run from the one thing I had been avoiding my entire life? But that night wasn't the end of our story. Far from it. What happened next would set in motion a series of events that neither of us could have predicted. The questions I had avoided for so long were now surfacing, demanding to be answered. And the consequences of those answers? Well, they were more than I could have ever imagined. Would I follow the path Nathan had laid out for me? Or would I walk away, forever wondering what might have been? One decision, one moment, could change everything. And as I stared at Nathan, unsure of what to do next, I knew the stakes were higher than ever before. But this wasn't the end of my story, it was just the beginning. So, what happens when you finally stop running from your own desires? When everything you thought you knew about yourself is turned upside down. Stay tuned, because this tale is far from over. In the next video, everything you thought you knew about us will be challenged. The choices we make will change everything. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Until then, be ready. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Was Nathan right? Should I have taken the leap, embraced the unknown, or was it all too much, too soon? Have you ever been in a situation where you felt torn between desire and fear? Where one decision could change everything? I know I'm not alone in these feelings, and I'm curious to hear your take on it. Drop a comment below and let me know what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have followed your heart, or would you have taken the safer route? Let's start a conversation about what it means to face our truths, to take risks, and to confront the things we often try to avoid. Everyone's story is different, but we all have something in common. The choices we make shape who we are and who we're becoming. And hey, if you found this video intriguing, or if you've connected with the emotions and the journey so far, don't forget to hit that like button. It lets me know that you want to see more, that you're engaged and invested in these stories. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of what's coming next. There's more to this story, and trust me, you won't want to miss the twists and turns ahead. When you subscribe, make sure to turn on notifications too. That way, you'll be notified the instant a new episode drops. There's so much more to explore, and I can't wait to bring you along on this emotional journey with me. Together, we'll keep digging into these complex relationships, these moments that shape our lives, and the risks we take that define who we become. And for those of you who are already part of the family, thank you for your continued support. Your comments, your likes, and your shares mean the world to me, and they motivate me to keep telling these stories, to keep digging deeper into the moments that matter. But there was also the inevitable moment when the question we had been avoiding surfaced again. What did this mean for the future? For our living situation? For the way we saw each other outside of this fragile space we had created? It was a conversation we had both been avoiding, not out of fear, but because we didn't know how to approach it. The fear of labeling it, of defining what this was, loomed large. What if it didn't work? What if we ended up losing the friendship that had meant so much to both of us? One night, as we sat in the kitchen, each of us nursing a cup of tea, Josh broke the silence. "Do you think we're making a mistake?" he asked, his voice quiet, barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't expected it, but in a way, I understood why he was asking. I knew he was as scared as I was. We had both been so careful, so guarded about what this meant, and now it seemed like we were both looking for reassurance that we weren't doing something reckless. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of his question settle in. "I'm scared too. But I also know that I don't want to lose this. Whatever this is, I want to see where it goes. If it's a mistake, we'll figure it out. But I don't think we should be afraid to try." Josh nodded, his eyes meeting mine with a mixture of relief and fear. "I agree," he said, his voice steady. "I don't want to lose this either." It wasn't a definitive answer. It wasn't the kind of resolution that wrapped everything up neatly, but it was enough for that moment. Enough to know that we were still in this together, still trying, still figuring it out. Over the following weeks, our bond continued to grow. We had hard conversations, moments of doubt, but we also shared more laughter, more closeness, and more understanding. We didn't have all the answers, but we were learning to trust each other more with every passing day. The months passed in a blur of quiet moments, deep conversations, and shared experiences. There were no grand declarations or sweeping gestures, just the steady growing certainty that whatever this was, it was worth fighting for. And while we still didn't have all the answers about the future, we both knew one thing for sure: we had each other. And that was enough for now. But even as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this story. Something still waiting to unfold. What would happen next? Would we stay in this comfortable space forever, or would we eventually face another challenge that would test us in ways we couldn't anticipate? All I knew was that, whatever came next, we would face it together. As the days passed, everything seemed to settle into a new rhythm. Josh and I were finding our way, navigating this uncharted territory with the kind of cautious optimism that only time could bring. But even in the midst of our growing bond, something in the back of my mind kept me on edge, an unspoken tension that I couldn't shake. One night, after a quiet dinner and a few drinks, the conversation turned in a direction I hadn't expected. Josh looked at me with that familiar mix of uncertainty and curiosity, and suddenly, everything felt different. "What if this was just the beginning?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, caught off guard by the question. What if it was just the beginning? What did he mean by that? Was he talking about us, or something else entirely? The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of something unspoken. As I stared into his eyes, the realization hit me: the story we had started was far from over. There were still things we hadn't addressed, questions we hadn't answered. And I couldn't help but wonder, what was next for us? Could we face whatever challenges lay ahead, or were we walking down a path that would ultimately tear us apart? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain: things were about to get even more complicated. But as we sat there, in that quiet moment, I knew the journey wasn't finished yet. It was only just beginning. Stay tuned to see what happens next. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. What do you think about taking risks for love? Do you believe it's worth stepping into the unknown, even when the stakes are high? I want to hear your thoughts, because this story isn't just mine. It's something we all can relate to. Love, vulnerability, and the fear of the unknown are universal experiences. Each of us has had moments where we've wondered if the choice we're making will lead us to happiness or heartbreak. In this video, we've witnessed the evolution of a relationship, from uncertainty to connection, but the real question remains: how far would you go for love? Would you let go of your comfort zone to explore something new, even if it feels terrifying? Or do you believe that staying within the safety of the familiar is the best choice? I want you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation about what it means to take that leap of faith in love. Have you ever faced a similar dilemma, where you had to choose between what's safe and what's truly fulfilling? Your perspective could help someone else who's going through something similar. So don't hesitate, drop your thoughts below and let's talk about it. And hey, if you've enjoyed this story and want to see where this journey goes, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I'm committed to bringing you more heartfelt, suspense-filled tales that dive into the complexities of relationships and the human heart. You won't want to miss what's coming up next. I promise, it's going to get even more interesting. Make sure to turn on notifications so you're the first to know when the next video drops. Trust me, you don't want to be left wondering what happens next. We're just getting started, and there's so much more to explore. So, once again, would you take that risk for love? I can't wait to read your responses. Thanks for watching, and until next time. Before you go, take a second to reflect. Have you ever faced a situation where love, trust, and fear collided? What did you do? What would you do if you had the chance to rewrite your choices? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective might just help someone else who's feeling the same way. Remember, you're not alone in this. We all have our own stories to tell, and I'm here to listen, to share, and to keep these conversations going. So, if this story spoke to you, hit subscribe, and let's keep the dialogue going. And until next time, thank you for watching, for being part of this journey with me, and for continuing to support these stories. With that said, thanks for watching. And until next time, take care and stay tuned for what's next.